Ethan Ward, a 36-year-old carpenter who built wooden furniture for local shops. His wife, Clara, was known for her gentle nature and her art studio, where children painted on weekends. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed perfect, two people building a life together in peace. But behind their closed doors, things were breaking apart. The smiles they showed in public were thin masks hiding growing resentment. Clara wanted to move to the city to expand her art career, but Ethan loved the simplicity of Pinebrook. Money was tight, and arguments about it had become routine. Clara had begun staying late at the studio, sometimes not coming home until midnight. Ethan started to suspect there was someone else. That thought ate at him slowly, like a splinter he couldn't remove. On a cold February evening, the storm outside raged while inside their small house, something snapped. No one knew what really happened that night, but the next morning Clara's car was found abandoned at the edge of Miller's Forest. Her keys were still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the mud, no blood. She had simply vanished. The town organized search parties, combing through the dense woods and nearby rivers. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Ethan cried on television, begging for her return, saying he would do anything to bring her home. Yet whispers spread through Pinebrook, whispers about the arguments, about the nights people heard shouting coming from their house. The police began to look more closely at Ethan. His statements about the night she disappeared didn't match. He said she left after dinner to visit a friend, but that friend claimed Clara never arrived. Detectives checked his recent purchases and found receipts for lime, plastic sheeting, and new gardening tools. When they searched his property, they noticed an area behind the old willow tree that looked recently disturbed. The soil was softer, uneven, as if someone had dug there. A team of officers began to dig. After hours of shoveling, they hit something, a layer of black plastic. What they uncovered beneath that tree would change everything. Wrapped carefully inside was a human body. The medical examiner confirmed it was Clara Ward. The discovery broke the town's heart. Ethan was arrested immediately. Cameras caught him being led away in handcuffs, his face blank, his eyes hollow. He told reporters he was innocent, that someone had framed him. But the evidence was against him, traces of Clara's blood in his truck, his fingerprints on the plastic, and the neighbors who swore they'd heard digging noises the night she disappeared. The trial was short. The jury took less than 4 hours to deliver a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. Ethan was sentenced to 40 years in prison. The house on Willow Lane was sold, and the art studio closed forever. Pinebrook moved on, but the old willow tree remained, its roots hiding secrets no one wanted to talk about. Yet even then, the story wasn't over. The truth, though buried deep, had only begun to stir. 10 years passed since Ethan Ward was locked away behind the gray walls of Harlow State Prison. The world outside changed, but his life stayed the same, slow, silent, and filled with the weight of a memory he couldn't escape. Every day he woke before dawn, made his bed, and walked to the prison workshop where he built small wooden boxes for other inmates. He spoke little, kept his head down, and avoided trouble. The guards called him the Quiet One, a man who seemed to have made peace with his punishment. Yet peace was the one thing Ethan never found. He replayed that night in his mind endlessly, convinced that something about it was wrong. He couldn't remember burying Clara, not clearly. Sometimes he wondered if his mind had made up memories to fill the empty spaces of his guilt. Other times, he thought he might truly be innocent but too broken to prove it. On the 10th anniversary of Clara's disappearance, a letter arrived for him. It was small, plain, and had no return address. When the guard handed it over, Ethan almost didn't open it. But curiosity won. Inside was a single line written in familiar handwriting: "You buried me, but I'm still here." The words froze him in place. His hands shook, the paper crinkling under his fingers. He showed it to no one. That night, he didn't sleep. The words echoed in his head like a voice whispering through the cracks of his cell wall. The next week, another letter arrived. This time, the handwriting was shakier, but still recognizable. It said only, "I'm closer than you think." The prison staff dismissed it as a cruel prank, maybe from someone who remembered the case. Ethan couldn't stop trembling. He began refusing meals and stopped working. Other inmates noticed and whispered that he was losing his mind. The warden ordered a psychological evaluation, but Ethan refused to speak. He just stared at the gray floor, clutching the letters like they were the last pieces of his sanity. Then one morning, the impossible happened. A woman appeared at the prison's visitor center asking to see Ethan Ward. She showed her ID and waited quietly while the guards checked the system. When the officer saw the name, his hands froze. The identification read Clara Ward. They thought it had to be a mistake, maybe some sick joke, but the woman insisted. She was calm, her voice steady, her eyes haunted. The fingerprints on her ID were checked against the old police database. They matched perfectly. Clara Ward was alive. News spread fast, reaching Ethan's cell before the guards could even prepare him. The man who had been convicted of killing his wife was about to see her walk into the room. When she appeared behind the glass divider, he didn't move. His face went pale, his breathing shallow. The woman sitting across from him was older, her hair darker, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes were unmistakably Clara's. She had returned from the dead, or perhaps she had never really been gone at all. For Ethan, the world tilted off its axis. Everything he thought he knew, every memory he had replayed for 10 years, began to unravel, one thread at a time. The news that Clara Ward was alive spread through Pinebrook like wildfire. Reporters crowded outside Harlow State Prison, broadcasting the story of a man who had spent 10 years behind bars for a murder that never happened. The townspeople who once hated Ethan Ward were stunned into silence. Some felt sorry for him, while others refused to believe it. But the truth was undeniable: Clara had come back. She sat with detectives and told them her story. According to her, the night she disappeared, she and Ethan had a terrible argument. He had accused her of cheating, and in fear, she ran from the house, driving aimlessly until she reached the edge of Miller's Forest. She left her car there and kept walking, too angry and frightened to return. She claimed she'd hitchhiked out of Pinebrook that same night, eventually starting over in another state under a false name. For 10 years she lived in hiding, terrified that Ethan would come after her if he found out she was alive. The police were skeptical. If she had truly run away, then who was buried behind the willow tree? The body found there had been identified as Clara through DNA testing years ago, but technology had advanced since then. To be sure, investigators decided to exhume the remains and run new tests using modern forensic methods. The results shocked everyone. The DNA did not match Clara Ward. The woman buried in Ethan's backyard was someone else entirely. Detectives began re-examining the evidence, combing through old files, photographs, and witness statements. The autopsy report from a decade earlier described a woman of similar height and build to Clara, but the details had been rushed, the identification made quickly under pressure from the media. Back then, no one doubted that the remains belonged to the missing wife. Now that assumption fell apart. The question grew heavier each day: who had Ethan actually buried? Ethan was transferred from his cell to an interrogation room. For the first time in years, he spoke clearly, his voice steady but empty. He told investigators he had found something strange behind the willow tree days after Clara disappeared, a patch of disturbed soil. When he dug into it, he found a body. He panicked. He thought it was Clara. In a fog of guilt and fear, he wrapped the body again and buried it deeper, too afraid to call the police. He convinced himself he must have done something terrible without remembering it, and when detectives later found the grave, he accepted it as proof of his own guilt. Meanwhile, the DNA results revealed the body's real identity. It belonged to Lila Carter, Clara's estranged half-sister who had vanished years earlier. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Lila had once lived with Clara briefly before disappearing without explanation. Now her remains were discovered in the same backyard where Ethan and Clara had built their life together. When confronted with this information, Clara's calm facade began to crack. She avoided eye contact, her hands trembling slightly. The police saw it, the flicker of fear that came when truth began to close in. Something about her story wasn't adding up, and the real mystery was only beginning to surface. Detectives pressed Clara for more details about her half-sister, Lila Carter, and how her remains had ended up buried behind the house she once shared with Ethan. At first, Clara repeated her story. She didn't know, she had no idea Lila was dead, and she hadn't seen her in years. But as investigators dug deeper, inconsistencies appeared. Lila had been reported missing nearly 6 months before Clara vanished. Old phone records showed that Clara and Lila had been in contact right before Lila's disappearance, even though Clara had claimed they hadn't spoken in years. Neighbors from their childhood home remembered seeing Lila visiting Pinebrook during that same period. She had apparently stayed with Clara for a few weeks, and then one day she was simply gone. When detectives presented Clara with this information, her confidence began to crumble. Her voice faltered, her breathing grew unsteady. It became clear that she was hiding something far bigger than anyone expected. Behind the scenes, forensic experts re-examined the burial site. The pattern of the soil layers suggested the grave had been disturbed twice. Someone had dug there before Ethan's supposed burial. That meant the first burial, the one Clara never admitted to, had happened before she left town. The evidence pointed in one direction: Clara had buried her half-sister long before she disappeared. Faced with mounting proof, Clara finally confessed. She said that Lila had shown up at her door one night, desperate and angry. Lila wanted money and threatened to expose a family secret that Clara had spent years hiding. The argument turned violent. In a moment of rage and fear, Clara struck Lila with a heavy object from her art studio. Lila fell, hitting her head against the corner of a table. The silence that followed was the kind that changed lives forever. Clara panicked. She didn't call the police. Instead, she wrapped Lila's body in plastic, dragged it into the yard under the cover of darkness, and buried it behind the willow tree. Clara's plan had been to leave Pinebrook soon after, but her guilt consumed her. She stayed, pretending nothing had happened. When she and Ethan began fighting, she feared he might discover the grave. On the night she left, their argument wasn't just about jealousy or money, it was about the secret she thought he had uncovered. When she saw him searching near the willow tree days later, she believed he had found the body. So she ran, certain he would turn her in. Ethan, on the other hand, thought he had unearthed Clara herself. In a haze of shock, he reburied the remains, thinking he was covering up his own crime. The full truth was almost impossible for investigators to believe. The man who had spent 10 years in prison for killing his wife had buried her sister instead, without ever realizing it. And the woman who had returned from the dead was not innocent at all. Clara's confession sent ripples through the community and reopened every wound the case had left behind. The story that had once seemed so simple had turned into a tangled web of guilt, fear, and tragic mistakes that no one could undo. When Clara finally confessed, the courtroom fell silent. Every camera pointed toward her as she sat trembling, her hands clasped tightly together, eyes lowered to the floor. The woman who had once been a symbol of tragedy was now the perpetrator of it. She admitted to killing her half-sister Lila in a moment of uncontrolled anger, burying her behind the willow tree, and then running away when her husband unknowingly uncovered the grave. Ethan, who had listened quietly from his seat, seemed frozen in disbelief. He had spent a decade haunted by guilt, convinced he had taken his wife's life, when in truth he had been living inside the shadow of her crime. The prosecutors dropped the murder charge against Ethan, and after 11 years in prison, he was finally a free man. The town of Pinebrook watched as he walked out of the courthouse with nothing but a small bag of belongings and a face worn by time. Reporters shouted his name, asking if he hated his wife, if he planned to sue the state, if he still loved her. He said nothing. The wind blew through his gray hair as he stepped into the sunlight, a man who no longer belonged anywhere. Clara was taken away in handcuffs, charged with voluntary manslaughter and concealment of a body. Her lawyer tried to argue that years of guilt and fear had already punished her, but the judge saw it differently. She had allowed an innocent man to lose 10 years of his life, watched from a distance as he was branded a murderer, and did nothing to stop it. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. As she was let out, she turned once toward Ethan, but he didn't look at her. He couldn't. The weight of her actions had crushed something inside him that could never be repaired. In the months that followed, Pinebrook tried to move on, but the town's name became linked forever to the story of the man who buried the wrong woman. Tourists came to see the old willow tree, some leaving flowers, others taking pictures. The house was eventually torn down, but locals swore the ground still felt strange, as if it held the memory of what had happened there. Ethan stayed in Pinebrook for a while, living quietly in a rented cabin near the river. He didn't speak to journalists or old friends. Sometimes people saw him sitting alone by the water, carving small wooden figures and throwing them into the current. Clara, in prison, began painting again. Her artwork was dark, trees with hollow roots, faces without eyes, hands reaching out from the ground. She told a counselor that she painted to remember, not to forget. In her final letter to Ethan, which he never opened, she wrote that she wished she had told the truth before it was too late. Years later, when both were gone from Pinebrook, their story remained a haunting reminder that truth doesn't always save people, it just changes who carries the pain. And somewhere beneath the soil where it all began, the willow tree still stood, its roots tangled around secrets that time could never completely bury.